Great, great, thank you. Okay, John, floor is yours.
All right, well, thank you all very much. Great to see so many familiar faces and some new faces as well. I'm gonna get going by seeing if I can share my screen. I talk a lot about digital skills, and I'm always overly proud of successfully sharing my screen. So does everybody see the PowerPoint slide that I have? Great, thank you very much. So what I'm going to talk about today represents some works in progress and also some ideas in progress. And the basic idea that I want to get at is several. One is look at what has happened since the pandemic with respect to connectivity in the United States. And that's idea one. The second broad idea is, has it mattered? Will it result in enduring policy change? It's easy to look around since the pandemic and see lots of initiatives to try to close the digital divide. As I say, the pandemic has become the national smack my head moment with respect to the digital divide in the United States, as many people who were hitherto unaware that some people couldn't get online suddenly figured out that there is a digital divide. So that manifested itself to me, it's been sort of two stages. One is, let's close the homework gap. That was the initial motivator last year when schools closed and classes became online. So there was lots of activity to try to address that. I think we're arguably in the neighborhood of phase two, which is, okay, we've done a lot to get more computers to households with school-aged children. We've done some things to try to get more connectivity to them, but what do we do in the longer term, and what do we do for other groups that might be behind the curve on digital tools? So I thought I'd just go through a bit of a context setting, a couple of minutes to talk about tensions of the past decade. In the US, at the federal level, the main program for universal service support on an individual basis is the Lifeline program. Fact is, participation in Lifeline has contracted substantially in recent years from about 12 million users of the Lifeline benefit in 2016 to 6 million today. For the most part, those are households signing up for wireless cell phone plans for their connectivity. Now, the reasons behind that contraction are pretty well known. One is circa 2010 or a little bit before, there were concerns about waste, fraud, and abuse in the program. What was going on was multiple households were signing up for service, or people who didn't qualify were signing up for service. So participation exploded actually to about 18 million participating in Lifeline at one point, some of it due to people signing up for it that shouldn't have been signing up for it. Some reforms were made, and to a significant degree, some of those issues have been addressed. The other part of the problem has been the contribution mechanism to support the Lifeline program and the universal service programs in general. As probably many of you know, Lifeline is supported by a tax on interstate telecommunications revenues, and the base for that levy has been declining over time, which means in order to meet the funding demands of the program, the amount of that levy has been increasing, and now it's over 30%, up from I think around 8 or 9% just a decade ago. That's unsustainable, and because of that reality, and because of an unwillingness to reform the funding mechanism, there have been incentives within the FCC to try to cap spending, and those efforts have been largely successful, not just as we see through the declining participation in Lifeline, but things like setting a budget to limit the amount of money available to Lifeline simply because the revenue source to support it is shrinking. So that's been sort of the, depending on how you look at it, the bad-ish news at the federal level over the past decade, declining support for a key part of universal service report. But at the same time, there's been a growing research base, and I'll have links to these research papers at the end of my discussion. There's been a growing body of research knowledge that shows that efforts to get more people online with broadband subscription have borne fruit. One, low-cost offers have been shown to boost broadband subscribership. A paper by Greg Roston and Scott Walston showed that in areas in the United States where there are low-cost internet offers, there has been a greater increase in broadband adoption in low-income communities than places where those offers are not available. That might seem common sense. However, you could imagine that adoption rates of broadband at home in low-income populations might increase over time, regardless of the presence of low-cost offers. There is and has been generally an upward drift in adoption rates over time. It could also be the case that adoption, these low-cost offers aren't really adding people to the network, but just getting people who have full-price offers, who qualify for these low-cost offers, over to these low-cost offers, which means, yes, they're getting a cheaper rate for broadband, but we're not getting an incremental increase to the overall number of low-income households online. Walston and Roston showed that it's not the case, that about 2/3 of the increase in subscribership in areas with low-cost adoption were due to the presence of these low-cost offers. Second, work that I've done has shown that investments in digital skills training does pay off in terms of increasing the likelihood of people using the internet for education and job search. This work I did using a sample of Comcast Internet Essential subscribers and asking them questions about whether they had training on how to use the internet and comparing that to the likelihood of using the internet for job search or educational purposes. And the work did try to control for selection bias and those sorts of things. And we did find a significant effect in that respect. And finally, there's work that has been done that has shown that connectivity has impacts on new users. For the sub-bullets talking about perspectives on life. For this work, I borrowed from the development literature, which has often used surveys to ask people how they would rate their life today and how they would rate their lives in 5 years. And it's been shown in the development context that if you have an optimistic perspective on your life, you're more likely to take steps to actually improve your life. So this technique of asking people to rate their lives on a scale of 1 to 10 can serve as a proxy for assessing the impact of particular interventions. And work I did again with Comcast Internet Essentials subscribers showed that going from not having connectivity at home to having connectivity at home with the Internet Essentials offer did result in about a 1-rung increase in people's perspectives on their lives in the future, suggesting that connectivity was having a positive impact on their lives. Finally, with respect to economic impacts, the economist George Zuo has recently published a paper that tried to assess the economic impact of having connectivity. Again, he was using a range of data sources, some of it on Internet Essentials subscribers from Comcast, also then combining it with data from government sources. And through that, he isolated a positive economic impact of having connectivity. So there has been a decent body of research over the past 5 or 6 years that has shown that actually taking steps to connect people not only can be done, but in turn does lead to positive impacts in their lives, with digital skills training having a role in helping accelerate that process for them. So let me now turn to what's been changing just in the past 18 to 20 months. Obviously, there have been lots of new initiatives and more funding for broadband. The slide goes through some of the monies already available or making their way available into the stream of society. 10 billion in the Treasury Coronavirus Capital Projects Fund, which is not exclusively for broadband, but it's allowable to use those funds for broadband projects, primarily infrastructure. There's been $1 billion for infrastructure in tribal lands, 300 million for broadband deployment grants from NTIA, 285, I think that has to be million, not billion, for HBCUs. And finally, states have gotten into the act. Since I'm speaking to folks based at USC, how could I not mention California? And the state has appropriated $6 billion for middle mile, last mile projects and a loan fund for, I think, largely municipal broadband types of initiatives. So California is putting money behind it. I think a distinct thing about California is that they have CETF, an institution that has expertise and institutional memory on these issues in the state and a track record of reaching communities as they seek to tackle broadband issues in their states or in their communities. That kind of institution is not present everywhere. I can think of states such as Minnesota, for instance, which is another example of a state that has a fairly well-developed policy apparatus to get broadband infrastructure to counties that need infrastructure. Since I live in Maryland, I had to talk about Maryland a little bit. Using CARES funding, Maryland has set aside $400 million for infrastructure, including a $15 per month subsidy for qualifying low-income households. So for Maryland, that means if you're a qualifying household, you can get a $15 per month subsidy for your internet service bill above and beyond what you might get from other sources, such as the Emergency Broadband Fund. So there's been lots of new activity, lots of it, as I said, initially directed at closing the homework gap. But as we see these funding streams, and I'll talk about funding from the infrastructure bill in a little bit, we see the prospect of sort of a more permanent kind of set of policy initiatives to try to close the digital divide. Let me talk about what we know about connectivity since the pandemic. And there's been a number of work done, some of it by me, but certainly not exclusively by me. The Pew Research Center has asked people questions about what they have experienced since the pandemic. And we see via Pew that about a quarter of Americans say that they worry at least somewhat about paying their internet bill. Half say it's the responsibility of schools to provide computers to students. And 90% say that the internet has been essential or important during the pandemic. And Pew's asked over the years a number of times whether people think the internet is, essential or important. That figure reflects an uptick in the incidence of people saying it's essential or important. Another really good piece of work on this topic has been done by Vicky Catt and Victoria Rideout, a March-April survey focusing on households with children between the ages of 3 and 13, and focusing on incomes under $75,000. They've done good work on this in the past, and they see that there has been progress in connectivity for such households since 2015. Cost remains a barrier to having service. And this data point is reflected on some data that I've collected that I'll talk about shortly. And it's been a reasonably consistent finding because the New America Foundation has done some work in this field as well. 18% of households lost their home internet connectivity during the pandemic due to struggles paying for service. And Katz and Rideout also look at the cell-only phenomenon, and they find that in that group of families with young kids, 11% are cell-only reliant, and 1/3 have hit a data cap. You might say 11% isn't so much, but if you have 1 in 9 kids in at below the median income in this country, not being able to get online for school, or only being able to get online for school with only a cell phone. I think a lot of people might see that as a problem. Work that I've done that, as Hernan said, came out just this week, was a survey for the city of Philadelphia. I'll talk about methods here for a second. This was a telephone survey of the city, and telephone surveys are expensive. The whole bill for this, between conducting the survey and the time for everybody working on it, came to $300,000 to do a survey with 2,500 completed cases. The response rate was on the order of 5%, which is low. I mean, when I got in this business almost 20 years ago, we would have response rates in the 36% range. I remember that as sort of a high watermark in the early 2000s when I was at the Pew Research Center. And now we're down to single digits, and obviously people are not responding to surveys for a whole bunch of reasons. And as I'm sure this group knows, the cost of conducting surveys comes from reaching people. And if you are, a sixth as likely to reach somebody in a survey today than 20 years ago, that means your cost is a lot higher. Maybe not 6 times higher, but a lot higher. But we opted for a telephone survey. This survey was done in July of this year, in part because the only other reasonable option would have been mail, using the US mail to reach people. But even in, certainly in July, there were issues about reliability of delivery of US mail, so that was a problem. And when we were making these decisions well before July of 2021, in March or thereabouts, it wasn't clear that the pandemic was going to be the right way. It wasn't clear whether, because of the pandemic, it was going to make sense to try to reach people through the US mail. So we chose the telephone survey, and that's where we landed. And we asked a series of questions about whether free or discount programs have made a difference. We found that yes, they had. 9% of all Philadelphia households have signed up for free or discount programs. Lots of these programs were targeted at K-12 households, and they were much more likely to have signed up for these. In terms of awareness of the programs, I characterize it as tepid. Your mileage may vary. 31% of respondents in Philadelphia had heard of Internet Essentials. 13% had heard of the emergency broadband benefit, which had only come online in the prior probably 45 days before this survey was conducted. We found, not too surprisingly, that affordability is a chief barrier for people not having service. And I'm going to get in a little bit to the question of affordability and what is affordable in a couple of slides. Another survey that I'm still working on, and you're getting a preview of some of the data from it, is done in partnership with Everyone On. And for that survey, we focused on low and lower middle income households, so households whose incomes are under $50,000 per year. And for the most part, we relied on a panel. We used the company SSRS to conduct the survey. They have an online panel of our participants from which they can select a representative sample of respondents, in this case, a representative sample of households under $50,000 per year. And so most of the data points here are from the panel. We were interested in people who aren't online, so we supplemented the panel, which had a total number of respondents of 2,500, with a telephone survey of about 383 people who are not online, so we could understand the not online population. And you can see that a couple of data points on what people have done since the pandemic. 40% searched for a more affordable service plan. 26% upgraded their plan to meet the needs of their households from having to do so much online from home, and a quarter purchased new computing devices. Now, matching what Katz and Rideout found, we found that 18% of all in the sample had a service interruption during the pandemic, and that was much higher for the very low income. We also constructed a group of what we call the internet, or rather the subscription vulnerable. Of connected households, half we consider subscription vulnerable because they say they lost service during the pandemic. They say that without having a discount offer as part of their service plan, they would have difficulty keeping service, and they live at or near the poverty level. If you meet any one of those criteria, we put you in the subscription vulnerable bucket, and about half of this lower income households group are in that category of being subscription vulnerable. As in Philadelphia, 9% of households have signed up for a free or discounted plan. So those plans certainly make a difference for a chunk of lower income subscribers. And affordability of service is the chief barrier. I want to talk a little bit about affordability. We did in this survey really try to get at what is affordable. Glenn may be able to speak to this because he perhaps lived some of this at the FCC. People talk about affordability, that we need to get affordable internet plans to people. But oftentimes there's not enough information or much information on what do we consider affordable. So in this survey, we asked people several different questions. One is we asked people what they pay for service. About 60% of the sample had cut the cord, which means they have a standalone internet plan. And this analysis is based on what those respondents say they pay per month for internet. Why do we focus on that? Well, because if you focus on people with bundles, people can't really disentangle what their internet service price is from their bundle. So we just focus on people with standalone offers and ask them what they pay per month for internet service. The average figure in the sample is about $62. Then we also asked people what they consider to be too expensive for their monthly budget to pay for the internet. And then finally, we also asked people whether, what was the third question that went into this? We asked them what they pay for it. We asked them what they would consider too expensive. And then we asked them generally whether they consider their current monthly internet bill to be a burden on their budget or not. So from that, we tried to tease out some perspectives on affordability. And this, somewhat busy chart shows that about a third of respondents say free is what they need in terms of an internet service plan. They don't consider, they just feel like any amount of money spent on internet per month is too much for their budget. Then we had some people who are online and budget constrained who basically said that $15 per month was okay for them. And then we had a sizable chunk of people who said $25 per month is, affordable for them. And then finally, we found that 42% of our sample of lower income respondents were okay essentially paying the market rate. These are people who are paying around $54 per month, and they also tell us they don't consider that figure to be too burdensome on their household budget. So if that's what they're paying, they're clearly going for lower end internet service plans more than likely on the market, but they're comfortable with it. So with respect to affordability, I think a clear takeaway is that it's not a one size fits all proposition. For 1/3, they need full subsidization of service if they're going to be considering what they pay affordable. A quarter are okay with around $25 per month, a little more than a quarter, and then the rest can handle market level prices. And if you're thinking about interventions to get more people online, I always feel compelled to remind people that, yes, solving affordability issues is important for people, but it's not the only kind of intervention needed. Digital skills training is needed. Outreach and marketing to make sure people are aware of these offers is needed as well. So I'm just going to wind up with just 2 more slides on whether all this represents real policy change. And here, I think it's worth taking a closer look at how things have evolved with respect to funding in the infrastructure plan since the beginning. Initially, the Biden administration proposed $100 billion for broadband. Most of that was for infrastructure, roughly on the order of 8-to-1 of infrastructure spending to digital literacy spending. So initially, overwhelmingly infrastructure. As things have evolved, the overall amount of proposed broadband spending has been reduced to $65 billion. But we see that $42 billion is for infrastructure, with the balance for an internet service subsidy and $2.75 billion for digital equity. So we sort of toggled away from a proposal heavily weighted toward infrastructure toward one that is on the order of 3-to-1 for infrastructure to affordability programs. So that's been a change that happened throughout the legislative process as the Senate primarily did its work on the bill. So this is a departure from the past in 2 ways. For one, we're now actively encouraging enrollment in universal service support programs. We focus on the enrollment rate of the emergency broadband benefit with the notion that it should be increasing and increasing quickly, rather than in recent Lifeline days worrying about too much participation, which would put a budget strain on that program. I think also this means that there's a recognition that innovation and market forces by themselves won't solve affordability. And I think that's been very much a theme in thinking about universal service for the past decade or more, that we didn't necessarily need to launch programs for digital skills or higher subsidies for service. We could let the marketplace and innovation drive down the cost of service, which would then increase adoption rates. Maybe that's happened to an extent, but with the pandemic showing that there are lots of still disconnected people, probably not sufficient for policymakers in today's environment, or at least many policymakers. And then finally, another important departure is that infrastructure funding is conditioned on carriers having low-cost offers. Up until now, low-cost offers have been, and including to this date, have been voluntary by carriers. There's been no requirement that they have them. Internet Essentials, I should say, was a merger condition from the Comcast NBC Universal merger of 10 years ago. Voluntary or not, people debate about that. Comcast certainly says it was voluntary. So the question is, will all this endure? I don't really know. Part of that hinges on 2 things: whether the infrastructure bill in fact passes and becomes law, which seems, I guess, a little more likely than it might have last week. But this does suggest that there's a new communications policy compact. That means a stronger role for the federal government in financing not just broadband infrastructure, but also digital literacy kinds of programs. It's also ensuring that states have the capacity for broadband planning and the means to deliver services on digital platforms. One element in the infrastructure bill is to fund planning at the state level for broadband. And it also indicates building local capabilities for serving citizens' needs through digital skills training. And that puts anchor institutions squarely into the picture. So will this really endure? Again, I can't give you a definitive answer, but I think questions to consider are, are we seeing a shift in our shared or governing understanding of the market? Is market structure a problem in the delivery of affordable broadband to people? If we're going to decide that that's the case, well, that could have serious implications in the policy sphere. What about the negotiating posture of government and industry? Communications policy has rarely made the headlines. It usually plays out among stakeholders who are used to being in the same room to talk about these issues. Will that change? Does a new role for consumers have a place at the table? Does the current societal focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion tip the discussion in some ways? And finally, does rural broadband deployment network gaps offer a chance for urban-rural coalition building? I think that actually promises to change how we think about broadband policy a great deal. I can tell you in Maryland that that certainly was a dynamic in the last legislative session, where there were state senators representing rural parts of the state who were all in on broadband funding because they want better networks, and they were happy to get that for those parts of the state, as urban lawmakers got funding for needs in urban areas, which usually aren't about infrastructure deployment. So the rural-urban dynamic, I think, is important. And with that, I can leave up a slide which has some links, and I can, of course, send these slides to people so they can click through these links if they want. But with that, I'll stop and happily take some questions and observations from people.
Thank you, John. Really fascinating presentation. Let's open up for questions.
I thought I saw Francois's hand up.
Yeah, maybe I'll start. So you mentioned at some point that California was doing very well, and you had the right answer for that, which is CTF helped with everything. I'm just curious about what else. But so yeah, we all appreciate the role CTF has played, but Glenn and I were talking about this a couple of days ago. I think there are a few other reasons that might have played a role. That the California budget is complementing the Lifeline subsidy to, I believe, an extra $5 or something. There is also a way to sign up people. When you sign up for SNAP, you get encouraged to sign for Lifeline. I'm just curious about what's your view on that, and especially, are there lessons we can take from the California experience that would carry over to other places?
Well, I know I see Susan shaking her head no about the SNAP observation. I do think that as we, whether what's happening reflects the long-term change, as I said, I don't know. Fact is, lots of money is in the system, and the expectation is that it will make a difference. Easing administrative or enrollment burdens are going to be crucial. There's literature that some of you may be familiar with about how sometimes bad administrative approaches are baked into program design in order to discourage participation. We're going to have to reverse that, and I think Lifeline has suffered from that in recent years in terms of really kludgy enrollment processes. There's supposed to be there is a national verifier database that in principle should help ease enrollment if you're a Lifeline person. It should connect the carrier when you're in the store trying to sign up to a database that shows that, oh, you're SNAP eligible. That means you're eligible for this. You're qualified. Here's your phone, out the door they go. That's how it should work. It doesn't work that way. And so fixing that is a big deal. and so that's going to require capacity at different levels of government, and institutions like CETF can help in sort of raising a ruckus about this. But and that said, there's a great deal of variance in capacity among states and within states that you'd like to think there could be investments in service delivery to help level that playing field. So like in California, San Jose has lots of funding set aside for digital inclusion. That's great, but what if you live in a city that isn't as well set up for that? Should you be penalized administratively, if you will, by geography?
I had a question for John. This goes back to the some of the results that you had shown and had been published about the concern about affordability, and I think you saw that in your Philadelphia results. Pew has been asking this sort of question for some time. CPS does it as well, and roughly 20–25% say it costs too much. But then they also ask the question about specifically to those who haven't adopted broadband, don't have home broadband, about reasons, and a high percentage, much higher percentage, say it's because they don't see the value of it, they're not interested in that. As a household budgeting matter, there's always trade-offs, right? You're trading off the cost with the value of the service, and I would I think it's safe to say that these households that don't have home broadband almost certainly have a cell phone. So they've made the decision in terms of cell phones that it's worthwhile, at least relative to the cost. So how do you cleave the different explanations? How do you actually get at affordability when you can trade off, as a matter of the family budget, and accommodate smartphones, but not broadband? I mean,
yeah, to that question, the way I ask the questions, which is different than how CPS asks the questions on affordability, the way I do it goes as follows. We allow respondents to choose from a list of possible reasons why they may not have broadband. They can choose as many that apply. In recent work I've done, they tend to pick a median of 3 out of 9. So there's usually multiple reasons why people don't have broadband. Then we ask them, what is the most important reason? Now, on the list of reasons people may not have broadband are, my smartphone does everything I want. I can't get service or good enough service where I live. I don't want or need it. I can use the internet elsewhere. I can't afford a computer. I worry about trust and security of data, and I'm not comfortable using computers. I hope I got all of them. So we ask a range of questions, and then step 2 is, what's the most important one? In the Philadelphia work, that's how we did it. 42% cited something pertaining to affordability of either service or computers. 22% said smartphone. So that's one way in which we can parse the smartphone versus affordability of service question. And it goes
so Pew has used the same strategy, right?
Maybe. I wonder why.
I wonder why, yes. Yeah. Thanks to you. There's consistent questionnaires, but I mean, isn't ultimately the answer to this to to try to do the ideal experiment where they face different prices, and it is a revealed preference for broadband, not a stated preference, which is, I think, still conflated with interpretation of what the value of the service is.
Yeah, I agree. I think that kind of exercise does have the issue of telling people to sort of weigh broadband, a service they don't have or don't have much experience with buying, you know, another communications good or service that they may have experience with. So, you know, I'm not going to state that my approach is the final word, but you know, other approaches aren't without issues either.
Well, we'd love to have randomized controlled trials where we
yeah, we would.
And I think Scott Walston looked into some of the FCC's innovations on Lifeline back a number of years ago, and some of the applicants for that program, or that experimental program, actually did some randomization. Okay.
Yeah, I'll have to look at that. I wanted to get to, I think I saw Ellen's hand up next, followed by Anna's, so we can get to folks in the amount of time we have.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Also to get the historical perspective on how the kind of funding landscape has changed quite a bit. I had a question about something you mentioned kind of earlier on about the change in perspectives on life and the economic impact, and because of the kind of study that we're doing, where we're from Digital Skills Tangible Outcomes projects are kind of more interested in the outcomes of this, rather than the digital inclusion bit is the social impact of either exclusion or inclusion. And I was just wondering, when you were talking about economic impact, what were you talking about there? And then this change in perspectives on life, kind of in what areas that they see most change? Was it kind of instrumental, financial, or was it also to do with more kind of well-being aspects? And to what extent do you think policy might also change its shift in emphasis on economic, or have you seen a shift in emphasis on economic aspects of it? In Europe, we're seeing a lot of kind of going back to the more economic aspects and creating like jobs and job skills and stuff like that, and less on well-being, actually.
I mean, I think that's always, the economic focus has always been a big focus here. For the economic impact that George Zuo looked at, he was looking at adoption in particular geographies, and then looking at changes in household income over time. So his was an income-based analysis in characterizing economic benefits. And I think he said that $2,000 roughly was the amount of economic benefit that people had due to being connected to the internet, against what he calculated to be about a $500 subsidy, and this is annualized, for getting those households online. So that's how he came up with his net benefit analysis. In the work I did, it was just asking people generally to state whether they think their lives will be better in 5 years and where it stands today. And what we were trying to look at was what factors might predict higher ratings by people. And just having a connection made a difference. And this goes a little bit back to Glenn's point. In the Internet Essentials sample, using the life rating approach, basically everybody in the sample had a smartphone. So they were going from smartphone connectivity to wireline broadband at home via this Internet Essentials offer. And there was a positive impact on life rating due to that additional connectivity path. That was a wireline plan that had no data caps and had higher speeds than smartphones. So that's how that was done in that context. And there was also then a digital skills impact that was not as big as the connectivity impact, but it did show that having had digital skills training was a contributor to people having higher life ratings in the way that we asked the question. Let me, with time scarce, see if there's time for Anna's question. Thank you for that question, Ellen.
Great, thank you. I had a quick question. You've done a lot of work on libraries, but after COVID, we've seen, a shift not only in the role that libraries are playing, but also thinking about, what is an anchor institution. I had some interesting conversations this week about different understandings of anchor institutions, and this can just be because, right, if you want to build out a community network, you might not be able, because of E-rate restrictions, to use a library. And so I'm wondering, you have a, sort of talking about this institutional memory and the importance of locally based, policy and sort of program development. Where do you see the future of anchor institutions going? I mean, we have this sort of idea of what they are historically, but I think in a post-COVID world, we're going to see maybe different understandings of that. And so I would be interested in hearing your opinion of what that is going forward and what those look like.
I mean, I think that remains to be seen. And I don't know if there's a quasi-experiment going on or not, or whether these interventions have enough characteristics to qualify as experiments. But there is this phenomenon of gap networks that we're seeing. Cities like Detroit, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, New York, and Harlem. These are neighborhood-driven wireless networks to basically provide free internet to a confined set of households in a neighborhood. So the reach of these things may not even cover something that's identified as that neighborhood. It might be a few blocks in the neighborhood, but it is going on. And I listed a few cities. It's going on in other places. I'm sure I've left some out. So the question is, what happens when neighborhoods have these free networks? And these networks are all aimed at very low income areas. I can tell you in Baltimore, some of them are aimed at the poorest parts of the city. And it remains to be seen whether they have an impact as intended. But do people sign up? Well, if they sign up, what do they do with it? Does their behavior mean you have the potential to see the kinds of results you've seen in other research showing positive benefits? If the answers are yes, then we've kind of defined, arguably, a new anchor institution, the gap network provider, and the series of actors that come together to do that. Remains to be seen.
Awesome. Thanks for the Baltimore call out, by the way.
Thank you, John. Perhaps, I mean, we can, I know people maybe have to leave, but John, if you have a few more minutes, I think at least I have one more question.
Sure.
And of course, everybody feel free to disconnect. I still want to talk a little bit about methodology. It's something that we think a lot about and work every day with. And I was looking at our numbers on the survey we did with CTF funding. Our numbers are very similar. The cost for phone surveys was about just under $100 per case. And our response rate was just slightly below 5%. So very similar. And then we use an online panel, and we did some comparisons, same questions, and results were quite similar. And online panel, the cost was $10, under $10 a case, with obviously a much higher response rate because these are panels, right? And so you know, we think through these things, and I mean, is this sustainable? Are phone surveys sustainable? Now, at the same time, how do we capture people who are not online, which is a major goal for this kind of research? So we're kind of in a bind here because everyone's moved to online surveys except those of us who work on digital equity, because that's our major concern. So how do you navigate that? What you're thinking about that?
Great question. I think qualitative research design can be very relevant here for those who are not online or recruited not online samples, neither of which are necessarily as good as a random sample of not online people that you could gather in a phone survey. But I know for the National Broadband Plan 10 years ago, we commissioned qualitative work by which some researchers did focus groups at public libraries. And so this was 10 years ago, and they recruited individuals who were not online or underconnected for qualitative work to try to understand what life not being online was like for those groups. Then there's convenience samples, which is going to when the pandemic is past, going to institutions where low-income people might go routinely for benefits of some sort, for instance, and doing interrupt surveys to see about that, which doesn't ensure that you're going to get not online people, but it's a possibility. The other point is, and this came across as helpful in the Everyone On survey, the portion of it that was an online panel. We had a particular interest in people with wireline broadband subscriptions at home. That's not the full universe of connected individuals. So we actually had about 15% of that online panel who did not subscribe to a wireline broadband plan at home. So we got to ask them a bunch of questions about what they do online with mainly their smartphones. Some people had satellite, and even a handful of percent had dial-up. So an online panel, if the focus is, for instance, on wireline high-speed plans, could make sense. I guess another way to think about it too is it'd be great if online panels could understand the speed of the network connection of their respondents, because that's another dimension of the digital divide that gets a lot of attention for obvious reasons. So if you know the speed of respondents, you can do a lot with trying to understand whether speed impacts attitude and behavior, because you'll know what their actual speeds are. So that's another idea, and I should probably tell my colleagues in the survey industry to start working on that.
Thank you, John. Any more questions? Glenn, you have a question?
Well, I just wanted to follow up, but this exposes my ignorance of the survey methods, but what about reaching people? We have ubiquity of smartphones for the most part. What about reaching them through a text survey? And you get the 15% that don't have a fixed line broadband at home. You got maybe a bit cumbersome, but you can reach them because they have a cell phone. And anybody do text surveys that way?
Yeah, I mean, that is done. Again, when your topic is digital equity, you start to run up against some problems, because older adults, for instance, are much less likely to have smartphones than everyone else. And that's, fun fact of the day. We focus on the homework gap in this country. The homework gap is smaller than the older adults' access gap. Also, I mean, people like to talk about how, everybody has cell phones, low-income folks too. Not true. I mean, low-income folks do have smartphones, but it's not ubiquitous in those demographics. And if you're concerned about equity, you run up against that for that kind of sampling strategy.
Okay.
We actually, in CTF, I think something that worked for us, we oversampled prepaid phones. That worked really well.
Oh, yeah.
And the vendors of cell phone numbers somehow can identify those prepaid phones, and I think that worked well to capture a lot of the Hispanic respondents, low-income respondents for us. But yeah, it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. John, I don't want to take more of your time. I don't know if you need to go, but are there any more questions for John? Okay. And again, John is I think now we can consider him a friend of the house. He's part of our board of expert advisors in the PUCTF work that we engage. So we'll definitely be hearing from you more. So thank you, John, and thank you, everybody. We have in a couple of weeks, we have Amy Gonzalez, who's going to be presenting. She's also part of the group of Board of Expert Advisors for the PUCTF project, and does fascinating work, more combining actually what John was mentioning, combining qualitative and quantitative work. So I think should be a great presentation. That's in 2 weeks, right, Li Chen? Am I right? It's exactly 2 weeks.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
we'll have Amy from UC Santa Barbara. So thank you, everybody. I hope to see you very soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you, John.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. That was great. Thanks. Bye-bye.